imagine stepping into the kind of sweltering summer night where the heat doesn't just sit on your skin, it physically presses down on your chest.
Oh, yeah, that kind of totally suffocating heat.
Exactly. So we're looking at August 25th in London. And our source material notes this was the peak of this completely unbearable heat wave, like literally the hottest day of the year.
Right.
The air is just stagnant, it's thick. And I want you to imagine you are walking into a pitch black house in a very wealthy, very quiet neighborhood on the edge of Hampstead Heath.
Which is usually a very serene area.
Yeah, but right now the electricity is totally dead. You are a police officer sweeping a flashlight through this suffocating darkness.
Just painting that picture gives me chills, honestly.
Right. So the beam cuts across the hallway. It sweeps into the living room. And the very first thing that beam catches is a woman. She's standing dead still wearing this white dress that seems to catch the light in this ghostly, almost luminous way.
But she's not making a sound.
Not a single sound. She isn't moving at all. She is frozen, staring off into the dark as if she's looking at something nobody else can see. And, the beam drops down. At her feet is a knife.
And she's badly injured, right?
Yeah, her wrists are deeply slashed, the cuts are fresh, and she is bleeding heavily onto the floor. But then you sweep the flashlight just a few feet to the side into the deeper shadows of the room, and there is a man.
And this is where the scene goes from tragic to just genuinely horrific.
Totally horrific. He is bound to a chair. The wire is wrapped so tightly around his wrists and ankles that it's literally cutting into him. And when the flashlight beam hits his face, well, it's not really a face anymore.
No.
He's been shot multiple times at point-blank range.
It is a profoundly visceral scene. I mean, to give you the context of who these people are, the man in the chair is Gabriel Berenson.
The famous photographer.
Exactly. He was a highly successful, widely renowned fashion photographer. And the woman standing frozen in the dark, bleeding from her wrist, is his wife, Alicia Berenson.
Who was an incredibly brilliant and celebrated painter in her own right.
She was, but what we need to establish right away is that this horrific tableau in the living room is not the climax of the story we are examining today. It's really just the inciting incident.
Wait, really? The murder is just the beginning?
Yeah. Because Alicia physically survives those cuts to her wrists. But from the moment the police break through that door and find her, she never utters another word.
Wow. Not a single word.
Not a single syllable in the hospital, not to the detectives interrogating her, not to her own defense lawyers, and not a single word during her highly publicized murder trial.
So that is the mission of our deep dive today. We've got this massive stack of source material in front of us. We're talking, clinical notes, trial transcripts, private diaries, psychological evaluations.
This is a goldmine of data.
It really is. And we're going to try and map the architecture of this entire tragedy. We're looking at the murder of Gabriel Berenson, obviously, but more importantly, we are trying to decode the impenetrable silence of Alicia.
Which is the real enigma here.
Right. We have to figure out why she used a very specific, haunting Greek myth as her one and only statement to the public. And we are going to trace the steps of a forensic psychotherapist named Theo Faber,
who basically detonates his own life and career in this dangerously obsessive quest to pry open her mind.
Which means we are moving far beyond the realm of your standard true crime procedural today.
Oh, absolutely. Who pulled the trigger is not the mystery here at all. The mystery is the mechanics of the human mind under catastrophic pressure.
Yeah, and we're going to get into all of that.
We're going to explore the neurobiology and psychology of trauma. We're going to look at the absolute failure of human language to capture the unspeakable. And we'll dive into the incredibly porous boundary between a therapist and a patient.
Let's start with the mechanics of the crime itself, though, because going through these police reports, the physical details feel incredibly contradictory to me.
How so?
Well, we know Gabriel was out all day on a Vogue shoot. He gets home late, around 11 p.m. Alicia's presumably in her studio at the bottom of the garden, painting.
Right, her usual routine.
Yeah. And then at 11:30 p.m., a neighbor hears gunshots, calls it in, and the police are there in under 3 minutes. They find the murder weapon on the floor next to Alicia with only her fingerprints on it.
So the physical evidence is completely unambiguous.
Unambiguous. But what trips me up is the staging. I mean, if you get into a screaming match with your spouse and you completely lose your mind in a fit of sudden impulsive rage, you grab a weapon and you strike. Right.
That's the typical pattern for domestic homicides, yes.
But Alicia took the time to find wire. She wrapped it tightly around Gabriel's ankles. She bound his wrists, That requires physical exertion. It requires time.
And compliance or unconsciousness from the victim.
Exactly. That doesn't read like a sudden loss of control. That reads like a methodical execution.
You are picking up on a crucial psychological discrepancy there. The physical staging at the crime scene tells a story of intense deliberation, but the violence itself, specifically the obliteration of his face, tells a story of unbridled, explosive emotional rage.
It's like two different crimes.
It really is. Let's look at the psychology of facial obliteration in forensic science. When someone is shot in the chest or the back, it is often what we call instrumental violence.
Meaning the goal is just to kill them.
Right. The goal is simply to end the biological life of the target. But when a perpetrator targets the face, especially with multiple close-range shots, it is profoundly expressive violence.
Because the face is where identity lives.
Exactly. Or rather, the face is the primary interface of human connection. To destroy the face is to unmake the person.
Oh, that's dark.
It is. It's an act of deep personal erasure. It suggests an animus that goes far beyond wanting the person dead. It is a desire to ensure they never existed in the way you once knew them.
So we have this highly organized binding of the victim, followed by highly disorganized hyper-emotional violence.
Yes. And then we have the immediate aftermath, the mutism.
Right, because when the police try to save her life, she actively fights them. It takes multiple officers to hold her down while she's bleeding out.
She was completely frantic.
They rush her to the Royal Free Hospital. She survives, and the police come to question her the next day. The notes here describe her lips fluttering, but no sound coming out. It's just a total void.
And the media obviously goes completely rabid over this void.
Oh, totally rabid. They project every possible trope onto her. You know, she's a black widow. She's a femme fatale. It was a twisted sex game. It was domestic abuse.
We needed a narrative.
But I want to know what is actually happening in her brain. I mean, is this a conscious legal strategy, or is her brain fundamentally broken in that hospital bed?
To understand what happens to Alicia, we really have to look at the neurobiology of severe trauma.
Okay, weigh in on me.
When the human brain experiences an event that shatters its foundational understanding of reality, like a massive system overload, the physiological response goes far beyond the standard fight or flight mechanism most people are familiar with.
Right. Everyone knows fight or flight.
But there's a third and fourth state: freeze and fawn or collapse.
I've heard of freeze, obviously, but what is the collapse state?
The collapse state is a profound parasympathetic nervous system response. When the brain realizes that fighting is impossible and fleeing is impossible, it basically initiates a shutdown to conserve energy and minimize pain.
Like playing dead.
In a way, yes. And in these states of hyperarousal and subsequent collapse, neuroimaging actually shows us that blood flow literally shifts away from certain parts of the brain.
Wow. Where does it go?
It goes to the survival centers. And one of the areas that experiences a massive decrease in activity is Broca's area.
And what does Broca's area do?
It is the region of the frontal lobe responsible for speech production and language processing.
Oh, wow. So it literally turns off.
Yes. In the aftermath of catastrophic trauma or during a severe PTSD flashback, Broca's area essentially goes offline. The brain is diverted entirely to the amygdala, the primitive alarm center.
That makes so much sense.
Because language is a high-level cognitive function. It requires linear sequencing, time-stamping, logical structure. But trauma is nonlinear.
It's just chaos.
Exactly. It is a chaotic flood of sensory fragments. Smells, sounds, pure terror. Words become grossly inadequate containers for what the nervous system is experiencing.
So when Alicia's lips flutter but no sound comes out, she's not just stubbornly refusing to talk.
No, it is highly likely we are looking at a genuine neurological failure to convert her reality into language.
That reframes the entire trial for me. Because reading the trial transcripts, the legal system has zero capacity to handle a neurological shutdown.
The legal system demands a cohesive narrative.
Right. The judge, Mr. Justice Alverstone, is incredibly hostile to her silence. He views it through a purely behavioral lens.
He essentially equates silence with a lack of remorse.
He basically says, you know, innocent people scream their innocence, guilty people who feel bad cry and show remorse. You are doing neither, therefore you are an unfeeling monster.
Which is a fundamental misunderstanding of trauma, and the media, of course, fills the vacuum of her silence with their own anxiety.
Society really abhors a vacuum.
Especially when it involves a woman who has committed a violent act. We rely on narratives to keep the world feeling safe and predictable. When a person refuses to provide a narrative, society projects its own darkest feels onto that blank slate.
But the defense brings in an expert, right? Professor Diomedes.
Yes, Diomedes. He is the clinical director of a secure forensic psychiatric unit called the Grove.
And he basically argues exactly what we are discussing now.
He does. He tells the court that her absolute silence is not a shrewd, calculated evasion of justice. He says it is empirical evidence of profound mental illness.
And it works. He successfully argues for diminished responsibility.
Right, and the judge ultimately sentences her to be committed to the Grove indefinitely, rather than a standard prison.
Okay, so she is locked away in the secure psychiatric facility. She won't speak. But looking through the timeline here, she does make one single statement to the outside world before the trial concludes.
And it's a very powerful statement.
It is. When she was discharged from the hospital and placed under house arrest, she was allowed access to her art supplies. Now, the sources say she usually paints incredibly slowly.
Very methodical, right.
Yeah, she takes months to finish a piece. But after the murder, she operates in a frenzy. She completes a massive oil painting in just a few days, and this painting is the only communication we get from her.
Which, predictably, the tabloids use as further proof of her psychopathy.
Natural.
The narrative becomes, look at this cold-blooded woman. She blows her husband's face off and then casually goes back to the easel 3 days later.
They view the act of painting as like a hobby.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Recreational.
Yeah.
Which is a fundamental misunderstanding of what art functions as for a traumatized mind.
Let me describe the painting based on the gallery notes because it is incredibly disturbing. It's a self-portrait. Yeah. Alicia paints herself naked in her studio.
Completely exposed.
Hyper-realistic, completely unsparing. You can see the veins under her skin. You can see the fresh, raised red scars on both of her wrists.
The physical evidence of her trauma?
Yeah. She is holding a paintbrush that is dripping with red paint, though it's heavily implied to look like blood. She is standing in front of a totally blank canvas. Her head is turned, staring straight out at the viewer, and her mouth is open, lips parted, as if she is screaming or trying to speak, but she is completely silent.
It's a literal depiction of that blocked Broca's area we talked about.
Exactly. And the key to this entire puzzle is the title she painted in light blue Greek lettering in the corner. Alcestis.
Alcestis. To decode this silent distress signal, we really have to unpack the Greek myth she is invoking here.
It's a pretty heavy myth.
It is. Alcestis is a tragic heroine from Greek mythology, famously dramatized by Euripides. The story goes that King Admetus, Alcestis' husband, is fated to die.
Bad luck for Admetus.
But the god Apollo intervenes and strikes a deal with the fates. Admetus can live, provided he finds someone willing to die in his place.
Which sounds like a great deal until you realize nobody actually wants to die for you.
Yeah.
He goes to his elderly parents, assuming they've lived long enough and will gladly take the hit.
And they refuse.
They completely refuse. All his friends refuse.
Right. The only person who steps forward and willingly accepts death so that Admetus can live is his wife, Alcestis.
So it's the ultimate sacrifice.
Yes. It is traditionally read as a myth about the ultimate, pure, self-sacrificing devotion of a wife.
But wait, this is where I hit a massive logical wall reading these files.
Why is that?
The myth is about a woman who willingly dies so her husband can live. But Alicia killed her husband. She tied him up and shot him. The metaphor is entirely backward.
It does seem completely contradictory on the surface.
Why would she align herself with the self-sacrificing wife when she is literally the executioner?
That is the exact paradox that forces us to look past the literal facts of the crime scene and into the psychological reality of the perpetrator.
Okay, I'm tracking.
The public sees the physical facts. Alicia killed Gabriel, therefore Gabriel was the sacrifice. But art does not traffic in literal facts, art traffics in emotional truth.
Oh, I see.
By titling the painting Alcestis, Alicia is telling us that the physical murder of her husband is only a symptom of a much deeper, hidden sacrifice.
You were saying she views herself as the one who was sacrificed.
Psychologically, yes. Think about it. What does it mean to sacrifice yourself for a relationship? It doesn't always mean dying physically.
It can mean, like, losing who you are.
Precisely. It can mean killing your own identity, silencing your own needs, or enduring unbearable abuse just to keep the idealized image of a partner alive.
So the painting is a coded map.
Yes. She is saying, look beyond the blood on the floor. Look at what happened to me. This is exactly where art therapy operates. When Broca's area shuts down, when words are impossible, the brain still needs to metabolize the trauma.
It has to get it out somehow.
Visual art bypasses the linguistic centers and allows raw, unprocessed emotion to bypass the conscious mind's defense mechanisms.
So we have a silent patient locked in a psychiatric ward and an impossibly dark puzzle sitting on a canvas. To decipher this, we need a guide.
We need someone who can actually read the map.
Exactly. And that brings us to the central figure of our source material, forensic psychotherapist Theo Faber.
Theo Faber is our lens into this world, and we really need to understand his operating system immediately.
Because he is an intensely complicated guy.
He is. He is a 42-year-old psychotherapist working at Broadmoor. Now, for context, Broadmoor is one of the most high-security psychiatric hospitals in the world.
It's like the pinnacle of the field.
It is. Yet Theo actively seeks out an open position at the Grove, which is a much smaller, less prestigious unit. And he does this for one singular reason. Alicia Berenson is housed there.
He uproots his entire secure career purely to get to her.
Which immediately tells us something about his boundaries.
Yeah, it sets off major alarm bells for me. In his interview notes for The Grove, when the director asks why he wants the job, he gives the standard polished answer. I want to help people.
The textbook answer.
But in his own private notes, he is brutally honest. He writes that he became a psychotherapist because he was, quote, messed up.
He believes that the vast majority of people drawn to mental health professions are fundamentally damaged themselves.
Desperately trying to heal their own minds by treating others.
It is the classic archetype of the wounded healer, a concept Carl Jung wrote about extensively.
The wounded healer. I like that phrase.
The idea is that only a healer who knows the landscape of their own suffering can truly navigate the suffering of the patient. But this requires a massive degree of self-awareness and regulation.
Which we quickly realize Theo completely struggles with.
He really does. To understand Theo's obsessive drive, we have to examine his developmental years. Because our sources dedicate a significant amount of time to his childhood trauma.
And the details of his childhood in Surrey are just suffocating. Theo grew up in an environment dictated entirely by fear.
His father was incredibly explosive.
Explosive, unpredictable, and violent. Theo describes this constant low-level terror, hiding under his bed, breathing in the dust, just praying his father wouldn't find him.
But his dad always did.
Always. He would drag Theo out and beat him with a leather belt until Theo was just a crumpled heap on the floor. And his mother offered zero protection. She was entirely passive, a victim herself, simply telling Theo that his father was mad.
This environment provides a textbook case study for some of the foundational theories of psychoanalysis, particularly the work of Donald Winnicott, who is explicitly referenced in our sources.
Oh, I want to get into Winnicott.
Winnicott famously stated, "There is no such thing as a baby."
Okay, I read that quote, and it literally stopped me in my tracks. Taken literally, it makes no sense. What does no such thing as a baby mean in the context of developmental psychology?
Winnicott meant that a baby cannot exist in isolation. If you observe a baby, you are actually observing a baby and its caregiver. The two form an indivisible psychological unit.
Oh, I see. Because the baby can't survive alone.
Exactly. A human infant is born completely helpless, not just physically, but psychologically. They lack a cohesive ego or a sense of where they end and the world begins.
It's all just one big blur to them.
Right. So Winnicott introduced the concept of the holding environment. If a mother or caregiver provides a safe, responsive, and physically secure holding environment, the baby's fragmented self slowly integrates into a cohesive personality.
They learn that the world is generally safe and that their needs will be met.
Yes. But if the holding environment is the opposite of safe,
if the person holding you is the person beating you with a leather belt,
then the foundational architecture of your mind is built on terror. If the caregiver is a source of unpredictable violence, the child learns that the world is inherently hostile. There is no safe place to integrate the self.
So what happens to the child?
The child remains fragmented. They are constantly scanning the environment for threats. They develop what Winnicott called a false self.
A false self, like a mask.
Exactly. A rigid, compliant facade designed to appease the abuser and survive. Meanwhile, the true self is buried deep inside, completely frozen and terrified.
And we see a devastating example of this fragmentation in the one memory Theo points to as a happy moment from his childhood.
The snowman memory.
Yes. His father goes away on a business trip during a very snowy winter. Theo and his mother go out into the garden and build a snowman. But they don't just build a generic snowman.
No, they consciously make it look exactly like the abusive father.
They give it his stern eyebrows, his hat, his umbrella.
And what do they do next?
They obliterate it. They pelt it with snowballs, laughing and destroying this effigy of the man who terrorizes them. It's this brief release of all that repressed rage.
It's so telling.
And later that night, Theo sneaks out into the snow alone. He holds his hands out, catches a snowflake, and watches it melt. He has this profound realization that there's a vast, quiet, beautiful world outside his house. But joy is as fragile as that snowflake.
It vanishes the second you try to hold on to it.
Exactly.
That memory perfectly illustrates how deeply his father's presence corrupted his capacity for joy. And the tragedy of developmental trauma is that you cannot simply pack your bags and leave it behind.
Right, because when Theo goes to university, he physically escapes the house, but he realizes he has internalized his father.
The abuser's voice has become his own inner critic. The terror follows him.
And it leads to a severe depressive episode in his first winter at university, where he attempts suicide. He systematically goes to different pharmacies, buying small packets of paracetamol so no one will get suspicious. He goes to his freezing room, and he swallows them.
It's a very methodical attempt.
It is, but the physical reality of that overdose is what shocks him back to life. It's not a peaceful fading away. It is agonizing.
Searing stomach pain, vomiting bile in the dark.
Right. And in the middle of that physical agony, his survival instinct kicks in. He realizes he doesn't actually want to die. He just wants the internal pain to stop.
And thankfully, he survives. And the university mandates that he see a psychotherapist named Ruth.
And this is where he discovers the power of the talking cure.
Yes. And his work with Ruth introduces us to another critical psychoanalytic concept that is vital to understanding how Theo operates as a therapist.
Which one is that?
The concept of containment, theorized by Wilfred Bion.
Okay, let's break down containment, because I think a lot of people assume therapy is just like venting to a blank wall. But containment sounds like an active, almost physical process.
It is highly active. Bion argued that an infant is constantly bombarded by raw, terrifying sensory data and emotions that it cannot process. He called these beta elements.
Beta elements, just raw panic.
Right. A mother's psychological job is to act as a container. She takes in the baby's terror, processes it through her own mature nervous system, and returns it to the baby as a digestible, soothing thought, an alpha element.
So she filters it for them.
Exactly. If a child lacks this container, they are left drowning in raw terror.
Which is exactly what Theo was doing. Without a container, he was using heavy marijuana use to artificially numb the terror.
Precisely. Drugs become a synthetic container. But when Theo sits in the room with Ruth, he begins to speak about his horrific childhood.
And he's entirely dissociated at first, right? He feels completely numb while talking about the abuse.
Yes. But he looks across the room and sees tears forming in Ruth's eyes.
She is crying for him.
She is actively containing his raw terror. She is holding the unbearable emotional weight of his trauma until his own ego is strong enough to process it. She digests the beta elements for him.
Wow.
This experience profoundly shapes Theo. It convinces him that therapy is not about being a detached clinical observer. It is about emotional entanglement.
Which leads to my absolute biggest question about Theo's professional ethics. I mean, if Theo believes therapy requires this deep emotional enmeshment, is it safe to have a man whose foundational architecture is this damaged, acting as the primary therapist for a woman who just committed a brutal murder?
It is highly, highly problematic.
He explicitly states he rejects the Freudian idea of the therapist as a blank slate. He believes he's an active, leaking participant in the room. He thinks his proximity to madness is what allows him to reach Alicia. Isn't that just a recipe for disaster?
It is the clinical definition of playing with fire. The massive risk here is countertransference.
Can you explain the difference between transference and countertransference?
Sure. Transference is when a patient redirects feelings about a primary figure, like a parent, onto the therapist.
Like getting irrationally angry at your therapist because they remind you of your dad.
Exactly. Countertransference, however, is when the therapist unconsciously entangles their own unresolved psychological needs, traumas, or desires with the patient.
Oh, wow.
Theo is not entering the room as a clean container for Alicia's trauma. He's bringing his own cracked container into the room, hoping her trauma will somehow seal his own fissures.
And he brings this highly volatile, personalized approach directly into the Grove, which is an environment that is actively hostile to his methods.
It's a massive clash of cultures.
Let's examine the Grove as a facility because it operates as this fascinating, deeply disturbed microcosm of the mental health system. Physically, it's a decaying Victorian building.
Peeling paint, mildew.
Exactly. Yet they've decorated the high-security reception area with blue couches and children's drawings. It's this jarring mix of kindergarten and a prison.
And the physical decay of the building mirrors the ideological fractures within its staff. The Grove is a literal battleground for competing philosophies of psychiatric care.
We have Professor Diomedes on one side.
Right. Diomedes, the clinical director, is theatrical, his office is filled with musical instruments, and he represents the psychodynamic approach. He believes that symptoms, even violent or psychotic ones, are a form of communication that must be explored and understood.
And on the complete opposite end of the spectrum is Christian. He's a psychiatrist Theo actually used to work with at Broadmoor.
Christian represents strict biological psychiatry.
He views mental illness primarily as chemical imbalances to be managed and suppressed, not mysteries to be solved.
Yes. And he is openly skeptical of Alicia, suggesting she is faking borderline personality disorder just to avoid prison.
Let's clarify what borderline personality disorder, or BPD, actually entails.
Yeah.
Because it is so often misunderstood and heavily stigmatized, exactly like we see with Christian's attitude.
BPD is characterized by a profound, terrifying fear of abandonment and severe emotional dysregulation. Individuals with BPD struggle to maintain a stable sense of self.
And they do something called splitting, right?
Yeah, splitting is a huge component. It means viewing people as either entirely perfect saviors or completely malicious villains with absolutely no middle ground.
So to someone like Christian, this volatility is just a behavioral management issue. His solution is medication, heavy medication.
What is she on when Theo arrives?
When Theo gets there, Alicia is being kept on a massive 16-milligram daily dose of risperidone. The source material describes her as essentially a zombie. She's slumping in her chair, drooling uncontrollably. Her hands are constantly trembling.
Wow. Risperidone is a potent, atypical antipsychotic. Its primary mechanism of action involves antagonizing dopamine and serotonin receptors in the brain.
So it shuts down the receptors.
Exactly. It is highly effective at reducing psychotic symptoms like hallucinations or delusions, and it severely dampens aggressive impulses.
But it's 16 milligrams.
At a dose of 16 milligrams, which is incredibly high, it functions as a chemical straitjacket. It blunts all effect. The trembling and drooling are what we call extrapyramidal side effects, which are motor control issues caused by the severe dopamine blockade.
Theo looks at this and realizes he cannot do psychodynamic therapy with someone who is neurologically locked in a vault.
Yeah.
You just can't analyze the communication of a symptom if the drug is suppressing the symptom entirely.
No, you can't reach them at all.
So over Christian's furious objections, and Christian explicitly warns that taking her off the meds will unleash her violence, Theo lobbies Diomedes to drastically reduce her dosage down to 5 milligrams.
And the change is rapid. As the dopamine blockade lifts, her motor control returns. Her eyes clear up.
But as Christian warned, the emotional suppression lifts as well.
Right. The raw, unprocessed beta elements of her trauma are no longer contained by the medication.
Which leads to a therapy session that genuinely shocked me as I was reading the case notes. Theo sits alone with Alicia in a small, bare room. Remember, he views himself as a relational therapist. He doesn't just sit in silence waiting for her to talk.
He decides to actively provoke her.
Yes. He holds up his hand, points to his wedding ring, and tells this silent, traumatized woman, I am a married man. I love my wife, Kathy, but sometimes I hate her.
It's a very calculated risk.
He tells her that love inherently includes hatred, and he insists that she must have hated Gabriel or she wouldn't have shot him in the face.
Let's analyze the therapeutic mechanism Theo is attempting to deploy here. In relational psychodynamic therapy, a practitioner might gently introduce provocative concepts to test the boundaries of the patient's defenses.
But he just went right for the jugular.
He did. He is trying to shatter her idealization of her husband. He is introducing the concept of ambivalence, the ability to hold two conflicting emotions, love and hate, simultaneously. He is trying to force her rigid, split worldview to flex.
But it doesn't flex. It violently snaps.
He attacks him.
Alicia explodes out of her chair. She launches herself across the room, tackles Theo to the ground, bashes his head against the wall, and wraps her hands around his throat. She is literally trying to strangle him.
And he's alone in the room with her.
Yeah. He is desperately groping the floor for his personal attack alarm while she draws blood from his neck. He finally hits it, the sirens go off, and it takes 4 nurses to pry her off him.
It is a catastrophic breakdown of the therapeutic frame. The clinical staff is in uproar.
Christian is totally vindicated, pointing out that dropping her medication led to an immediate attempted murder.
But Theo's interpretation of the assault is deeply revealing of his psychodynamic bias. He is sitting there with a concussion, bleeding, and he insists that the attack was a massive breakthrough.
Which sounds insane.
He argues rage is a powerful communication. She was telling me not to give up on her.
I mean, that sounds like massive psychological gymnastics to justify a failure. But going back to the idea of containment, Theo realizes she is talking. She's just using physical violence instead of words.
Right.
And there's a fascinating detail in the sources about how the tension inside the Grove operates as a system. The conflict between the staff Theo wanting her to feel, Christian wanting her sedated, is actually being acted out by the patients on the ward.
You are referencing systems theory in institutional psychology.
Exactly.
A psychiatric ward is an incredibly sensitive emotional ecosystem. The patients, who often lack strong ego boundaries, act as barometers for the unconscious anxieties and conflicts of the staff.
So they pick up on the staff's secret drama.
Yes. If the staff is secretly furious with each other but maintaining a polite clinical facade, the patients will often manifest that unexpressed aggression.
We see a perfect example of this with another patient, Elif. Elif is a highly volatile woman who murdered her own family. She is constantly acting out, smashing pool cues, creating chaos.
And she targets Alicia.
Yes. Theo discovers that months prior, Elif deliberately provoked Alicia. Elif walked up to her in the canteen and explicitly asked, what did Gabriel look like when his skull was broken, his brains all spilled out?
God. It is a grotesque provocation, but it serves a clinical purpose for Theo. It confirms that Alicia's violent outbursts are not random endogenous neurological misfires.
They aren't just random symptoms.
Right. They are deeply reactive. They are triggered by external stimuli related to her trauma. But Theo realizes that the sterile, highly controlled environment of the Grove is never going to yield the true source of her trauma.
The environment is too defensive.
So he makes a radical, boundary-breaking decision. He leaves the hospital to investigate her past in the real world.
He effectively turns from a psychotherapist into a private investigator. He tracks down Alicia's remaining family, starting with her brother-in-law, Max Berenson.
Max is Gabriel's adopted brother, right?
Yeah, a wealthy, imposing lawyer. When Theo asks about Alicia, Max's professional facade just cracks. He bluntly admits he loathes her, and he reveals a medical secret that was completely missing from her official files.
Which is a huge red flag.
Years before the murder, Alicia attempted suicide by taking a massive overdose.
This missing data point is absolutely critical. It tells Theo that the homicidal break was not an isolated incident. It was the catastrophic eruption of a pressure cooker that had been building for decades.
They had a long fuse.
Exactly. In psychoanalytic terms, homicidal rage is rarely born entirely in the present moment. It is deeply rooted in the land before memory, the foundational childhood trauma. The current event, whatever happened with Gabriel, was simply the match that lit a very old fuse.
So to find that fuse, Theo travels to Cambridge, to the house where Alicia grew up. And the environment is like something out of a Gothic horror novel.
It's completely decrepit.
It is a decaying Victorian house near a muddy river, completely overgrown. There's a massive weeping willow tree in the backyard. Theo is snooping around looking at the house when suddenly he is struck violently on the back of the head with a baseball bat.
Just completely blindsided.
Yeah. He regains consciousness on the ground to find Alicia's cousin, Paul, standing over him. Paul thought Theo was an intruder. Paul lives in this crumbling hoarder's nightmare of a house, acting as an unpaid caregiver to his mother, Alicia's Aunt Lydia.
Theo actually goes inside to meet her, right?
He goes inside to meet Aunt Lydia, and the atmosphere is toxic. She is surrounded by junk, breathing from an oxygen tank, and she speaks about Alicia with absolute venomous hatred.
What does she say?
She calls her a little bitch and is furious because Alicia once painted a highly mocking, unflattering portrait of her and displayed it publicly. Between Aunt Lydia's seething resentment and the squalor of the house, it becomes agonizingly clear why Alicia was so desperate to escape her family and build a new, perfect life with Gabriel.
But the true map of Alicia's psychological landscape doesn't come from these interviews. It comes from her own hidden diaries, written in the suffocating weeks of the heat wave just prior to the murder.
The diaries provide a real-time account of a mind undergoing severe decompensation.
Yes. The atmosphere in the diary entries is incredibly claustrophobic. She writes about the relentless heat, how the grass in the garden looks like it's on fire, how the air is unbreathable.
And she's painting something specific.
She is obsessively painting a portrait of Jesus on the cross. But she writes that she had a sudden shock when she stepped back from the canvas. She hadn't painted Jesus. She had unconsciously painted Gabriel's face.
Wow. That is a textbook manifestation of splitting and idealization.
It really is. For Alicia, escaping the horrific trauma of her childhood required finding a savior. She elevated Gabriel from a flawed human husband into a divine, infallible figure of absolute goodness. He rescued her.
But the danger of splitting is that when you idealize someone to that extreme, you leave no room for human error.
The pedestal is incredibly precarious.
And the diaries show that pedestal starting to crack. They argue over a rifle. Gabriel insists on keeping in the house. Alicia's terrified of the gun. She hates its presence.
But mixed in with these anxieties are these moments of pure, transcendent hope.
Right. Gabriel takes her for a birthday picnic under a weeping willow tree, which directly triggers the memory of the willow tree at her horrific childhood home. Yet, under this tree, Gabriel proposes they try to have a baby. Alicia is overjoyed. She says yes.
Notice the psychological tension there. She is associating the willow tree, a symbol of her deeply traumatized childhood, with the creation of new life. But we also know from the text that she harbors an intense buried fear regarding her mother.
Yeah, we learned that her mother died on a car crash when Alicia was a child, a crash Alicia survived.
But Alicia's dark secret is her suspicion that her mother didn't accidentally lose control of the car. She suspects her mother deliberately drove into the wall, attempting a murder-suicide.
She is terrified that her mother's madness is genetic. She is terrified that the urge to destroy is running in her own blood.
This touches on the concept of intergenerational trauma. Whether she believes it is literally epigenetic, passed down through her DNA, or psychologically inherited, she views herself as inherently contaminated.
And Gabriel's desire for a child forces her to confront the terror that she might pass on this contamination, or worse, become her mother.
Exactly. And right as she is grappling with this immense internal pressure, the diaries reveal a devastating external shock involving Max Berenson.
This part is so disturbing. One sweltering evening, Gabriel invites Max over for a barbecue. Max arrives already sweating and heavily intoxicated. While Gabriel is out in the garden tending the grill, Max corners Alicia alone in the kitchen.
It is a moment of profound boundary violation.
Alicia confronts Max about a previous incident at a party where he supposedly assaulted her. Max aggressively denies it, but then his demeanor shifts. He grabs her arm, he physically pins her, he tells her he loves her, and he forces his mouth onto hers, shoving his tongue down her throat.
Alicia's response is instinctual and violent.
She bites his tongue so hard it bleeds profusely. Max recoils, his mouth full of blood, and immediately shifts to threats. He warns her to keep her mouth shut about what just happened.
And here is where the silence begins. Alicia decides not to tell Gabriel.
Let's look at the mechanics of this choice. If you are assaulted by your husband's brother, the logical step is to tell your husband. But Alicia stays silent. Why?
Because she knows that Gabriel absolutely idolizes Max.
Exactly. If she tells Gabriel the truth, she destroys Gabriel's relationship with his brother. She destroys the pristine world her savior lives in. Silence in this context isn't a symptom of madness. It is a desperate, twisted form of protection.
It is an attempt to prevent the psychological shattering we discussed earlier. If Gabriel is the idealized, all-good object, and Max represents the intrusive, abusive, all-bad world of her past, the collision of those two realities is catastrophic.
So she just absorbs it.
Alicia stays silent to maintain the structural integrity of her split worldview. She must absorb the toxicity herself to keep Gabriel pure.
But the tension of holding that toxic secret is destroying her. And what is so incredibly compelling about our source material is that while Theo is excavating the destructive power of Alicia's silence, his own life is violently mirroring the exact same psychological trap.
This brings us to the devastating parallel narrative of Theo's own marriage.
To understand Theo's unraveling, we have to look at how he conceptualizes his wife, Kathy. Kathy is an American actress. She is described as vibrant, chaotic, and full of life. They met serendipitously at a bar when they were both on dates with other people.
And Theo describes their early courtship, specifically a date in the humid, tropical environment of the Kew Gardens greenhouses, as a thawing of his frozen soul.
He literally refers to her as his invitation to life.
He views Kathy as his reward. He believes that finding this bright, beautiful woman is the universe's way of balancing the scales for the horrific abuse he suffered as a child.
She is his savior, much like Gabriel was Alicia's. But then the foundation cracks. Kathy starts coming home late from rehearsals. She becomes distant, irritable, and secretive.
The anxiety of this distance triggers Theo's deep-seated abandonment trauma. Without the secure holding environment Kathy provided, he reverts to his old maladaptive coping mechanisms. He needs a container.
One night, when he is alone in their apartment, he gives into the anxiety. He goes to Camden and secretly buys marijuana from a dealer, relapsing into the habit he thought he left behind when he met her.
He is seeking that synthetic container.
Right. He gets incredibly high. And while he is stoned, clumsy, and deeply paranoid, he accidentally knocks over Kathy's laptop on the coffee table. The screen wakes up and her email inbox is completely open.
What he sees shatters his entire constructed reality.
The subject lines are immediately incriminating. They are a long chain of emails between Kathy and a contact named Badboy22, which Theo deduces is her theater director, Tony.
And he opens them.
Theo starts reading. The emails are explicit. They are highly sexual, intimately confessional, and make it undeniably clear that the woman who saved him is engaged in a passionate, ongoing affair.
The physiological reaction Theo experiences in that moment is profound. The marijuana high evaporates instantly, replaced by a searing, agonizing clarity.
He rushes to the bathroom and violently vomits.
The body is literally trying to purge the toxic reality the mind has just ingested. Unable to stay in the apartment, he wanders the dark streets of London.
And unconsciously, his body navigates him to the only secure holding environment he has ever known, the home of his old therapist, Ruth.
He rings her doorbell in the middle of the night. She lets him in, sits him on her familiar couch, gives him a glass of sherry, and he pours out the entire agonizing story.
And Ruth, analyzing the situation, points out a brutal, unavoidable psychological truth. She tells him this isn't just about Kathy cheating. This is repetition compulsion.
Repetition compulsion is a foundational concept proposed by Sigmund Freud in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Freud observed that traumatized individuals have an unconscious drive to recreate the exact conditions of their early trauma.
It seems counterintuitive, though. Why would you seek out the pain that broke you?
The psychoanalytic theory is that the ego is attempting to retroactively master a situation in which it was completely helpless. By recreating the dynamic, the unconscious mind hopes that this time the outcome will be different. This time, the abuser will love them.
Ruth brutally dissects his marriage. She points out that Theo has unconsciously traded one abuser for another. He grew up terrified of a violent, unpredictable father, and he has married a deceitful, emotionally unavailable wife.
He is bending over backward, trying to please an abuser just so he won't be abandoned.
She tells him, love that doesn't include honesty doesn't deserve to be called love. She insists he must confront Kathy and leave the marriage.
But Theo is faced with the ultimate terror of the abandoned child, the void. Leaving Kathy means returning to the freezing, isolated darkness he lived in before she saved him.
So Theo makes a choice that seals his fate. He goes back to their apartment. Kathy eventually notices the jar of marijuana he left out.
Yeah.
She gets furiously angry with him for doing drugs.
Which is incredibly manipulative.
It's a perfect opening, right? He has the ultimate trump card. He could say, you're mad about weed. I read your emails with Tony. But as he looks at her, he decides that losing her would be like amputating a limb without anesthetic.
So he swallows the words.
He apologizes for the drugs. He chooses to pretend he never saw the emails. He chooses absolute, total silence.
It is a moment of staggering, tragic hypocrisy. Let's look at the irony here. Theo Faber is a forensic psychotherapist. His entire professional identity, his entire vocation is predicated on the talking cure.
Yeah.
He goes to the Grove every single day, battering at the walls of Alicia's silence, insisting that buried emotions will inevitably rot the psyche and manifest as violence. He literally tells a traumatized woman she must speak her truth to survive.
And then he goes home, looks at the ultimate betrayal of his own life, and voluntarily locks himself in a fortress of silence. He becomes a mute patient in his own marriage.
He utilizes the extreme defense mechanism of denial. He actively compartmentalizes the unbearable reality of his wife's infidelity just to keep the structure of his life from collapsing.
This parallel fundamentally alters how we must view Theo's quest to cure Alicia. It forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question about his clinical motivations.
Absolutely. Is Theo obsessively driving himself to cure Alicia because he cares about her recovery? Or is this an act of massive psychological projection?
Is he frantically trying to rescue this silent woman from her psychiatric prison because he feels too cowardly, too paralyzed to rescue himself from the silent prison of his own marriage?
If he can force Alicia to speak the unspeakable, perhaps he won't have to.
So, synthesizing all of this, we're looking at a landscape that is entirely defined by the destructive weight of things left unsaid. We have the sensory overload of Gabriel's murder on the hottest night of the year, a violent obliteration of identity.
We have the myth of Alcestis, a woman who sacrifices everything for a man.
We have Alicia, who physically survives her trauma but psychologically perishes, choosing a bloody canvas over language. And we have Theo, a supposed healer of minds, descending into a self-imposed purgatory of denial to protect an illusion.
It forces us to reconsider the fundamental premise of psychoanalysis. We place immense faith in the talking cure. But these narratives challenge the utility of language in the face of absolute trauma. When reality shatters completely, does talking actually cure the wound, or does it merely dilute the truth of the horror?
I want you, listening to this, to reflect on the architecture of your own life. What truths are you actively swallowing to maintain the status quo? When you silence your own anger, your own suspicions, your own hurt, at what point does that silence stop being a shield that protects you and start becoming a toxic pressure that inevitably destroys you from the inside out?
And as you reflect on that, consider one final chilling detail from the Greek myth that anchors this entire tragedy. In the original story by Euripides, Alcestis does not stay dead. Heracles wrestles with death himself and brings Alcestis back from the underworld.
So she comes back to life.
He reunites her with her husband. She's physically alive again, but she never speaks another word. She remains completely, permanently mute. It suggests a terrifying possibility. Perhaps true, catastrophic trauma doesn't just damage our vocal cords or our memories. Perhaps it fundamentally kills the part of the human spirit that believes language can ever truly bridge the gap between our pain and another person's understanding.
Is Alicia's total shutdown actually the most sane, rational response to an insane, violating world?
Is the demand that we speak our trauma sometimes just society's way of putting a tidy bandage over a wound that, by its very nature, demands to remain open and bleeding?
Think back to that flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness of that London house. The beam illuminating a woman in white, frozen in time, staring into the dark. Sometimes, the most terrifying monsters aren't hiding in the shadows waiting to attack us. Sometimes they are the ones looking back at us in the mirror, their mouths wide open, screaming in absolute deafening silence.